From Jared Taylor to many other race realists, the supposed biological ties between race and intelligence is the consistently repeated talking point that supposedly proves that there is a biological explanation that clearly points to less intelligence mainly being the supposed result of genes that are tied to a person's race. But when you sit back and watch through their videos, you will notice something strange about the claims made by the alt-right and other race realists, that being that for claims supposedly being made on the basis of biology and with the proposed authority of that field within STEM research, there are almost no biology papers or studies that are presented as evidence for their case. The bell curves showing different racial IQ averages are often showed as supposed evidence to support their hypothesis. Lists of nations ordered by IQ test results, social studies on IQ test performances, and on and on. And what unites all the evidence for a supposed biological cause that is given by these people is that none of their supposed evidence has anything to do with biology. Almost all of it is social studies. Instead, what is created here, rather than giving us biology studies, is an obsession with IQ results and attempting to present these as findings from biology. What these people do not realize is that if the causal link between race and IQ can't be proven by them through studies conducted within the scientific field of biology, then the causal link that they proclaim can be dismissed as coincidental, since it is mainly based on sociological studies and therefore it is not sufficiently documented to be based in actual biology. Every other explanation for the IQ gap can then be seen as just as valid as long as no evidence for the biological correlation is given. Mere statistics on intelligence difference claims based on genetics are pointless without showing the sufficient biological evidence that would back up and prove conclusively that it is actually genetic, something called physiology or physiological evidence, the study of the various chemical interactions, functions, and resulting mechanisms within the living system. Physiological evidence is the most important evidence that one must provide in order to make claims based on biology. And when claims are made on the basis of genetics, evidence from the field of molecular biology is required, showing which proteins are expressed by the genes the claim is made over. If there is no study isolating that gene and its expressed proteins to conclusively show its physiological function, then any claim about the function of that gene is void and based upon nothing but speculation. To make proclamations on the functions of various genes, organs, other components of the living body, or on the biological basis of physiological phenomena without physiological inquiry proving any such hypothesis can at best contribute to the spreading of falsehoods and at worst contribute to disaster. To give examples, Aristotle in 400 BC and Galen in 200 AD both proclaimed that the heart was the center of thought and reason, that organs such as the brain and the lungs merely existed to cool down the heart. This notion of the heart being the center of thought persisted despite being completely false throughout antiquity and the medieval era, and even into the Renaissance, perpetuated even by intellectuals of these eras such as Da Vinci and René Descartes throughout these time periods until the inception of physiology and the consequent inquiry into the actual functions and mechanisms within the living body. As such, an assumption that was not followed up by physiological inquiry, namely that the heart is the center of thought and reason, persisted due to the lack of physiological evidence and thereby perpetuated and continued a notion that fundamentally is a falsehood. An example for a catastrophic outcome for such a lack of scientific due diligence can be found in recent history within the last 100 years. The idea that mental illness can be influenced through outside factors such as stress and traumatic events buried within the subconsciousness was for considerable time rejected by psychiatry, who believed all mental illness was organic and that the cause of such can be found within malfunctions of the brain. As a result, many psychiatrists throughout the 1920s and 1930s, most famously Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz, started experimenting with operations on the open brain based on that assumption. assumption, without having any actual solid physiological understanding of the various functions of the brain. In essence, cutting up, destroying, slicing through and removing parts of the living brain, thereby producing mentally crippled, docile and damaged people, inflicting severe damage upon their patients, however driven into continuing, celebrating and selling this horrendous and damaging practice to the public known today as lobotomy. They did so by being convinced of their assumptions without having any actual physiological evidence for its factuality. To bring this back to our conversation with an example, if you were to find a gene that is encoded on a chromosome that has a high prevalence of genes that encode for proteins that are involved in skeletal muscle development, you cannot simply claim that this gene is responsible for skeletal muscle development. You have to prove through its expression and physiological translation that it does so. Analyze the protein structure and then do histological testing to see not just how much of it is present, but where it's expressed in the body's tissues. So if you do all of these tests, you might find that the proteins are only expressed in fat cells and in very minute quantities. In short, you have to prove that this gene produces the proteins responsible for something such as skeletal muscle development. If you are unable to do so and you are still making these claims, you are only guessing and speculating. Amongst those that proclaim a biological reason for these differences in intelligence between race is the alternative hypothesis. And the reason why this video is about him in particular is that so far he is the only one I have found providing any kind of studies that actually come from STEM. And he also seems to be the main source of most alt-right speakers found on platforms such as YouTube and Twitter. So for this video, we will take a closer examining look at the studies and arguments he presents here, because these studies are not sociological and as he seems to be the semi-official alt-right science man. In Race and IQ-related genes, point 1. IQ-related genes, alternative hypothesis presents us with 7 studies that supposedly showed 9 genetic variants that are tied to IQ. Now, before even going through these studies, there's something important to bring up on the subject of genetic ties to intelligence, ignoring the various different social studies and sociologists with no biology or medical background whatsoever coming to conclusions on the basis of social studies. If you ask a geneticist what ties intelligence to genes, as I did, you will find that there are actual examples. One of them is dendritic spine density. Higher dendritic spine density does not necessarily mean that a person will have a higher intelligence, but it is a very good indicator that a person has a greater potential to be more intelligent. The reason being that these dendritic spines have a greater surface area, consequently allowing more neurotransmitters to be transmitted as a result, meaning signals will transduce faster. On top of all that, dendritic spines can transform their configurations within a single minute. And it is very important for you to understand that this process is governed both directly and indirectly by around 1,200 genes, for which there is physiological evidence that they impact that process. Everything from spine formation, maturity, and death are extremely regulated and controlled by a myriad of balances to counteract those counterbalances. So to stand there and to proclaim that you have found 9 individual nucleotides within 9 genes, which are supposedly the A-team of what the scientific studies have supposedly shown to be the prime influences over a complex physiological process governing intelligence, is frankly very unlikely. To explain, let's take an example far less complex than intelligence, since intelligence is influenced by social factors. Blood pH, which is not influenced by any social factors. Our blood pH is supposed to be 7.4. It is maintained in the body by sodium bicarbonate, which is carried through our tissues and bloodstream by proteins which are maintained by the gene SLC4A7. However, for that gene to maintain that function of the human physiology, it requires a lot more genes to work together in concert with it. In order for it to have an enhanced effect, for example, to resist pH imbalances more than an average person, as for example a lot of people of European descent have in relation to alcoholism, reason being those people of European descent have 2 subunits of an enzyme that breaks down alcohol, thereby affecting the blood as well as tissue pH. For that enhancing effect to occur, it requires over 100 genes that we know of in a very specific concert to have a slight difference in performance. It is never just 3 genes or 9 genes or a dozen genes. It is a very specific building plan from which, if you remove only one single little aspect, the entire thing ends up having completely different results. But that is not the only reason why the alternative hypothesis falls flat on his face with the 7 studies he gives as examples for his arguments. When you read through his description of the first study, he claims that 3 SNPs explained 2.2% of educational variance within a group of 101,069 people. A SNP, or single nucleotide polymorphism, represents a difference in a single DNA building block called a nucleotide, commonly known as SNPs. They can be used in genetics as biological markers to help locate genes for further study to then show how they are expressed, ergo, which function they play within the organism and what they cause and such. Another really important thing to take into account with SNPs is that while you can have some SNPs which cause utter havoc on a person's health with things like sickle cell, a SNP may have no functional difference whatsoever for a gene. How is that, you may ask? Well, proteins are made of amino acids, and some amino acids are hydrophilic, meaning they play nice and interact with water, and others are hydrophobic, which makes them resist interacting with water and other polar charged molecules. If the nucleotide that is different from the standard setup in a gene encodes for a slightly different amino acid in a hydrophobic core of an enzyme that doesn't affect its binding potential or overall structure, then it means absolutely nothing. A lot of SNPs are like this and do not matter at all. Hell, there are SNPs that don't generate any difference in the amino acid chain at all. And with that in mind, showing whether these SNPs generate a functional difference in what they're encoding for is also suspiciously missing from these papers. When you read the study itself, you will see that its effect size is very small, at 2%, which is approximately the equivalent of 1 month of schooling. Not according to me, but according to that very study itself. And it is therefore not a stretch to say that the difference of 1 month in schooling is no evidence whatsoever for a IQ gap caused by genetic variation, and because of its small size, it is well within the margins of error. More importantly, neither this study or any of the others that are presented here as evidence for genes found tied to intelligence answer the important question, the most important question in fact. How? Meaning, where is your physiological evidence? None of them provide any physiological evidence that shows how these genes supposedly impact how these genes influence intelligence. All these studies provide is a mathematical correlation between these SNPs and variations in academic performance. And on top of all that, all these studies provide zero in physiological explanations for how these genes supposedly impact intelligence by implementing a change amongst a person's brain. Which, in the words of the geneticist who helped me extensively with the research of this video, is
my biggest issue when I'm reading through these papers that were on this alternative hypothesis website that, well, for the racial IQ differences that they're describing here, is that they talk about these SNPs, and they're saying here you've got 9 SNPs. Okay, so these 9 SNPs are going to be responsible, they think at least, for this significant difference in performance on IQ tests. Now, to illustrate properly how ridiculous that claim is, you have to understand here that just because a SNP is present within a cell or within any gene doesn't mean that it has any functional difference downstream for that gene. It may not even produce a single difference in the amino acid chains that make up the proteins that are going to be transcribed later out through the ribosomes. So if there's no functional difference, then that SNP amounts to fuck all. And you have to understand that we, on record, we have millions of SNPs, millions of them, and a lot of them don't do a damn thing. I mean, some of them have effects that are pretty damn significant. You can get sickle cell disease from a SNP, where you have a valine substituted for a glutamic acid in your the beta globin subunit here for hemoglobin. But that's rare. It's really rare that you're going to have a SNP that has any real significant effect downstream. And for them to say, yeah, we have mathematical correlations with these people in different racial groups that perform significantly different on IQ tests. Well, okay, how do you know that those 9 SNPs are causing this effect? It could be a whole host of other SNPs. I mean, a lot of these papers even admit to this and say that there are hundreds of thousands of other SNPs that these 1 or 2 that they're talking about could be influenced by to have a very negligible effect at most. And so they didn't do any histological analysis where they're looking, okay, where are these proteins being expressed? Because not every goddamn cell does the same thing. The cells of fat inside your ass cheeks don't function like the cells in your hippocampus, okay? There's a difference. They don't transcribe the same genes. Some of them, there's crossover, but there's a big difference. And so you need to actually take a look at where these tissues are going to have this protein expression going on. You need to do protein analysis. And once you've done all that, which I didn't see a single one of these papers do anything that even resembles that kind of analysis, then maybe you've got something to work with here. And I'm not saying that, these SNPs in combination couldn't possibly have an effect. It's just that it's extremely unlikely that they're going to have that massive of an effect between population groups, because most of human history, we were separated into different groups, separated by continents and oceans, and you didn't have genetic flow between a lot of groups. So, of course, there's going to be a different prevalence of SNPs in different groups of people. We're not uniform, which actually works out great for us in terms of our resilience against all kinds of diseases. Genetic variation and variability is great for that. It means that not all of us are going to die the next time a superbug comes around. But, these papers are not well written. They're very poorly put together with the assertions that they claim. I mean, them making this as the foundation for the argument that racial differences in performance of IQ is based on these SNPs it's an incredibly flawed argument that has next to fuck all for evidence that's going to make any real claim that can hold up to any real scientific scrutiny. So yeah, it's not very well done. Not very well done at all.
None of these provide any kind of physiological explanation that would give a satisfactory explanation tying certain genes to variation in intelligence. However, there is one study that goes a little further than merely showing a mathematical correlation. Genome-wide association studies establish that human intelligence is highly heritable and polygenic. Right from the offset, they state that the SNPs that they are talking about are affected by literally hundreds of thousands of other SNPs, namely 549,692. And the study finds that there is maybe a 1% variation if the SNPs in question turn out to have the effect they believe they may have, ergo, again, within the margins of error. The SNPs they examined are protein kinase genes. What are protein kinase genes? Protein kinase are enzymes that phosphorylate proteins. A functioning cell not only produces CO2 as waste, but also broken protein chains from doing complex functions, and protein kinase cut these up to be reused and recycled in other amino acid chains. It's a basic cleaner of the cell. Important for us, everyone has these. Even bottom feeders in the ocean have these. Without these, you wouldn't function. Your digestion wouldn't work, your skin would fall apart, and everything within your body would collapse. This is not something that is supposedly more prevalent in white people. The claim within this paper is that a superior variant from an SMP with that gene is responsible for a higher IQ. And the problem with the paper, however, is that it ends with that. The same flaw as with the other paper turns up, namely namely that there is only a claim with a mathematical correlation and no physiological evidence, because they do not examine their own claim that this SMP enhances intelligence. However, they do state in this paper that these SMPs are highly regulated and that more participants are needed to narrow down what the effects are, and that they need to take a deeper look into the other SNPs as well, which number in the hundreds of thousands. And the question there is, what effect those have in transcription? And the paper authors state that this is a set of questions that they will not be able to answer anytime soon. All papers present correlations without any physiological evidence to back up any correlations as real and based in biology. Those correlations are often within the margins of error, and only one of these papers actually states that more research is needed and that other SNPs need be examined. So in conclusion, the first claim by alternative hypothesis that these 9 variants were shown to relate to IQ is simply false. There's absolutely zero physiological evidence for his claims. And on the basis of that mistake, the next point of the article and the argument also falls apart. In essence, what the alternative hypothesis is saying in this section is that when you take one of these 9 SNPs, there is a 61% probability that you will find the remaining 8 SNPs within the same person, and then continues to state that the SNP frequency by race is 36% for blacks, 53% for whites, and 60% for Asians, and therefore mirrors a racial IQ hierarchy. However, as we have seen before, there is zero physiological proof in these studies that any of these 9 SNPs cause a difference in intelligence whatsoever. I also can't resist in this case to show the reaction by the geneticist helping me when I showed him this segment in one of our calls.
Right. Here's the thing. Let's talk about that, the different percentage of prevalence within different racial groups. Once again, that argument has a very flawed foundation, that making the claim that these 9 individual SNPs are going to be causing this significant difference in intellectual performance and neurocognitive ability. And, the foundation that has been laid is already very highly flawed and poorly laid to begin with. But to be quite frank, there are SNPs that exist between different tissues. For example, if I were to take sample tissue from your liver, right, and then take another sample from like muscle and out of your arm or wherever, skeletal muscle tissue or smooth muscle tissue, doesn't fucking matter. You're going to find different SNPs in your liver cells and from your muscle cells. So looking at SNPs within different tissues, so what if you've got different SNPs in different tissues? Because, for example, I could have a SNP in my heart that is more prevalent among Asians than it is in white people. And then let's say I've also got a SNP in, let's say, one of my glute muscles or something like that that's more prevalent among blacks. Do I have black booty and then I've got Asian yellow fever heart? I mean, what's your example here for how this makes any damn difference? That's within the same person. And so using different SNPs to indicate different people as being significant, well, okay, there are random variations, but still, like, so what? Why does this matter? This really has no weight if you don't have a functional significance to those SNPs.
Section 3, Signs of Selection. Here he explains something that is true. Due to separations of population groups over many generations, there are resulting barriers in gene flow. But then he continues to say that Piffer looked at this analysis by analyzing the standard deviation in SNP frequencies across populations and found that random SNPs have a random deviation of 0.46 compared to 0.06 for a set of 66 SNPs related to height and 0.88 for the 9 SNPs related to IQ. Thus, these supposedly IQ-related SNPs not only show signs of selection, but the signs of selection are stronger than those of SNPs related to height. And again, the claim is faulty because there is no physiological evidence for these 9 SNPs affecting intelligence, and therefore the idea that there is more selective pressure amongst whites and Asians to be more intelligent is also nonsensical, not only because of the lack of physiological evidence for those SNPs being related to IQ, but because of a misinterpretation of selective pressure. Let's take a step back. Basics. When you have a selective pressure, that means that if compared to other specimens without that trait, a specimen has a certain trait or characteristic that makes it more likely to survive and pass on its genes compared to other specimens without that trait, that it will be more likely to reproduce and pass down that trait. Take sickle cell. It's a nasty disease, but there is a selective pressure that makes people who have those genes resistant to the malaria parasite. Ergo, a selective pressure advantage. Now for intelligence. What is the selective pressure for intelligence? Obviously, the selective pressure for intelligence exists throughout the human species, because if you don't have the required intelligence to, for example, farm, build up provisions for winter or for dry seasons, you are going to starve. How to hunt, how to make a bow, how to preserve meat, and on and on. All these factors are selective pressures that contribute to who gets to live and who dies. So the notion of there being selective pressure to be intelligent is correct. In our day and age, it is considered attractive to be above average intelligence, underlining the role it plays as a selective pressure today. But arguing that a loosely defined group of people called whites have more of a selective pressure to be intelligent than a loosely defined group of people called blacks, or that a loosely defined group of people called Asians supposedly have a higher selective pressure to be intelligent than anyone else due to their environment, is simply not true. We frequently hear this notion from many race realists that different climates cause different selective pressures for intelligence, that our intelligence has selectively evolved around how we overcome the challenges of our environment, and that therefore separated population groups need different degrees of intelligence to overcome the challenges of their environment. And that notion, as sensible as it may sound at the beginning, is nonsense. What makes you believe that the intelligence required to overcome a winter in Europe is more than the intelligence required to survive a sub-Saharan dry season? What makes you think that surviving the American plains makes you dumber? What makes you think that overcoming a sub-Saharan dry season makes you dumber than those who have to overcome the monsoon season in Asia? Or just living in an environment as cruel and unforgiving as the Sahara Desert? It is simply not the case. Dutch and British immigrants who settled in South Africa during the past 300 years didn't start becoming dumber because the supposed environmental selective pressure of Europe was suddenly replaced with those in Africa that supposedly make you less intelligent. British colonials in Hong Kong and Singapore over the past 200 years didn't become smarter because the supposed selective environmental pressure of Europe was replaced with that of Asia. And for a final example, Americans didn't become dumber because they were Europeans who suddenly settled in an environment that supposedly has less selective pressure for intelligence and therefore supposedly made the natives dumber.
It doesn't make any sense based on the environment, because those are environments that have their own challenges that are pretty damn significant. People in Egypt don't have a lovely mild spring where they can just harvest a shitload of crops with tons of fertile land and what have you. They had to make use with limited areas to farm and harshing heat and all that stuff, things like that to survive for a very long time. And, looking at it on an acute level, let's say we talk about European settlers to Africa or over here in the States, we haven't gotten that much different in a lot of ways, if you look at just encoding. But in terms of intelligence, no, we haven't gotten dumber over here since we came here, or my ancestors came here as colonists. It doesn't make any sense to say, though, because we're in a different environment, because I got family out in West Texas where it's dry as a bone and hot as hell, that we suddenly got dumber. It's not the same thing for the people in white people in South Africa. They didn't get dumber the past several centuries because they're in a different environment. You're not giving me an explanation for how they're supposed to be getting less intelligent based on a different environment. And some of them will say, okay, well, it hasn't happened yet because not enough time has passed. And I'm like, okay, that's actually a somewhat fair point in the sense that you're going to need a long time. I'm talking thousands and thousands of years usually to have a significant change in capability within a group of people. But you still haven't explained why you require less intelligence to survive in those areas. Surviving in an area where you have harsh conditions, regardless of whether it's hot or it's cold, requires brain. So again, this whole notion of saying that you're going to get dumber over time, they just haven't explained that in any meaningful way that holds up to any scrutiny. So I don't really see any validity in that whole environmental shift with intelligence.
But now let's move on to point 5. Point 4 seems to be missing for some magical reason, but no matter, because his conclusion really is the shit-stained cherry on top of this shit cake. Quote, thus molecular genetic evidence on IQ-related SNPs supports the race realist position. This certainly strengthens our case, but some people will regard this as the only evidence worth considering, and this, the find the genes argument, is a mistake. And that's rather funny, isn't it? An article dedicated to proving how certain genes are supposedly tied to intelligence that ends with the claim that it is not required to actually put any effort into trying to find the genes tied to intelligence anyway. That's maybe because the alternative hypothesis knows that none of the papers he quotes provide evidence for such claims, or because he's simply an idiot who doesn't understand how scientific inquiry works in the natural sciences such as biology. And the latter is probably more likely when you read the next paragraph. Quote, it should be obvious that we can infer that differences are caused by genes without knowing what the genes are. Let me repeat this. It should be obvious that we can infer that differences are caused by genes without knowing what the genes are.
Oh my god. Here's the thing. His entire argument up to this point, whoever the author of this site is, I forget the guy's name. It doesn't matter. But the point is, his entire argument up to this point has been about genetic significance between racial groups in terms of neurocognitive ability. And to say that, okay, we don't need to find these genes, well, these papers that he's citing state specific genes already, which means if his hypothesis is correct, we already know what the genes are. But he's saying we don't need to understand anyway. Okay, there could be differences genetically that cause this difference in performance, but we don't need to know how it works. Just believe me. Just take it on faith. I'm just like, Jesus Christ, man. This is going to be the scientific foundation that you're laying your entire claim on, and you're saying we don't really need to understand how it works. Are you fucking kidding me? Dude, get the fuck out of here. This is absolutely ridiculous. If I were to go to a conference, right? And I'm gonna make the claim, okay, guys, listen up. You're gonna love this shit. I've got the answer here to how we can use in vivo transfection with Cas9 kits with no rejection process. I can transfect every cell in a person, lickety split, and you can make whatever shifts you want without killing the person. And everybody raises an eyebrow and says, "Oh, really? You figured that out? Well, how does that work?" I'm like, you don't need to know. You don't need to understand how. I just know. It's just like, the fuck? If I went to a conference doing anything like that, people would laugh thinking I was shitting them. It's like, no, you can't be serious. You're going to be making a claim that's pretty audacious to begin with, and you're basing it on science right here. You're saying there's a scientific basis for this, but we don't need to understand the details. Don't need to know those pesky little details. Dude, this is something that just screams snake oil salesman. To the nth fucking degree.
Let's apply this glorious logic to something else. Mental illness is caused by demons infesting people's souls. And I do not need to prove this because we know that mental illness exists. What is the point of this article in the first place? What is the point of arguing such a silly position? What he is arguing here, the self-styled alt-right science man, is in essence a complete rejection of all scientific inquiry by biologists into these issues. Essentially saying, I proclaim that the cause is biology, and I'm so damned sure of it that I will reject all biologists who take a look into the matter to either prove or disprove it. Let's continue. Quote, prior to the 20th century, nobody even knew what a gene was. Well, that's weird. I thought Gregor Mendel conceived the idea in the 1850s. But anyway, clearly then, there are many valid scientific ways of testing hereditarian views that aren't about finding the genes. Of course, the genes seem to be on our side, but our case was strong even before we had to confirm this. None of the studies he quotes here support his conclusion, and a strong case is definitely not being made here. Finding the genes and more importantly, showing how they work, how they express themselves within an organism, is dismissed here by the alternative hypothesis as if it were an unnecessary burden preventing the supposed truth from coming out, when in reality the scientific physiological evidence that a geneticist would have to produce is the one and only single deciding factor in this entire argument, and the only evidence that would actually count. Without it, you are merely speculating on the basis of social studies and mathematical correlations which hold no sway whatsoever in STEM research. And let's underline this point, because I believe I will have to repeat it frequently in the future. Sociology is not biology. This video took a little longer than expected. I am unfortunately dependent upon the time of people with actual expertise in this matter, that being a selection of biologists and chemists I have gotten into contact with and worked with over the past 2 months, throughout various long group calls and chats. So don't be surprised if the next one of these takes a long time as well. I might consider working on videos where I am not so heavily hindered by my lack of qualifications in the time between these videos. But more importantly, I am obliged to give credit where credit is due with each such heavily researched video being published. This video here would have been impossible without the resources, time, lectures, explanations and research provided by 2 amazing individuals. The Swedish chemistry student Sandra, who also runs a YouTube channel mainly dedicated to debunking pseudoscientific nonsense and false claims that are made by misappropriating and deliberately falsely representing scientific papers. You will find a link to his channel in the description, and you can follow him on Twitter at @TheSandraGuy. Link to his Twitter account will also be in the description. The other person who was invaluable in the production of this video and helping me and many more involved gain a better understanding of the subject matter is an American geneticist who unfortunately does not have the time to run a YouTube channel. However, you can find him as Synthetic Dissident on Twitter at ChemSavant47, and you can enjoy his unique southern charm and humor.